Hello everyone and welcome to the Knowledge Pool, the source regarding everything you need to know about the rules of Magic the Gathering. And today we'll be covering some modern interactions that you can see in the current metagame. Let's begin. First up, there is the interaction between Ragavan and Dress Down, two very popular cards right now in the modern format. And the question here is, what happens if we play Ragavan and either there is a Dress Down already on the board or someone plays it in response? So let's begin covering everything. First things first, we will cover the dash ability of Ragavan because this is the most important part. Obviously the Dress Down will remove the ability to exile the top card of the library regardless of whether it is played in response to Ragavan, it's already on the board, or it's played after we play the Ragavan. So let's take a look at the dash ability because it's a little bit more complex than one might think. So dash represents three abilities. There are two static abilities which function while the card is on the stack, and one which creates a delayed triggered ability. So what does dash do is three things. It's an alternative casting cost of casting a creature spell with dash. The ability essentially means that we may cast this card by paying the dash cost rather than its regular mana cost, and the delayed triggered ability, it says it's that if we pay the dash cost, we return that spell to our hand or to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. And also the other ability that it gives the creature is that as long as this permanent dash cost was paid, it has haste. So with all that covered about dash, let's see the interaction. So it's our main phase and we are trying to cast Ragavan with the dash cost. Our opponent responds with Dress Down. What happens? Well, obviously Dress Down resolves, and then our Ragavan enters play. Now the question that is most prominent here is, does Ragavan have haste, and do we return it to our hand at the beginning of the next end step? Let's break each of them down separately. For the returning to hand, we actually do return Ragavan to our hand because dash does not give the creature a delayed triggered ability that says that at the beginning of the next end step return to hand. It is set up when we pay the dash cost. So as we pay the dash cost and the spell is put to the stack, if the spell resolves, a delayed triggered ability is placed and the game remembers, okay, during the end step, wait, you have to do this. So whether or not the Dress Down is played in response, is already on the board, or is played after we play the Ragavan will still return to our hand at the beginning of the next end step, no matter what. The tricky part here is the haste part. So, do we need to differentiate the situations? We actually don't, because the result is always the same whether Dress Down is played in response, it's already on the field, or is played after we play the Ragavan. Here's what happens. We have two continuous effects that try to affect the same layer. Now this is a layer question. Layers are a bit complicated. We will explain them very briefly here, but I plan of course to do a separate video for layers and especially dependency, which is one of the most tough parts of the whole CR. So when we have two effects that try to affect the same layer, here is the layer that adds or removes ability, which is layer 6. We usually use the time step order, so whatever essentially happens the latest will apply. But there is a special case which is called a dependency check. So for dependency we have to take a look as when it happens. So for there to be a dependency between two effects, they have to be two things. First, they have to be on the same layer, and secondly, if we use one before the other essentially will not be able to exist. In this example, because Ragavan is the source that grants itself haste, if Dress Down is used first, that ability will not exist. And so therefore, because the thus granting haste is dependent on Dress Down, we apply the Dress Round event first, which means that the creature loses haste because it's not able to have an ability when it would gain it. Therefore, the end result is no matter what happens, whether we play the Dress Down in response while the Ragavan is in play, or if the Ragavan is already played, the Ragavan will lose haste. Now, here's the important part. If Ragavan has already been declared as an attacker, he won't stop attacking. He has been already declared as an attacker. So if you want to stop Ragavan from attacking, what you need to do is cast Dress Down either in response, or if you want to wait, you can wait before the attack has been declared. So to sum up what happens here, Ragavan will always lose haste if it's played through Dust and there's the Dress Down, we play the Shroud response, and it will always return to the hand at the beginning of the next end step, assuming the Dust goes to Spade, no matter what. Last thing to mention here is that I included Ragavan because it's the only card with Dust that currently sees modern play, but this rule will be applied the same into any card with Dust. But what will happen if the creature had Evoke instead? The next interaction is Dress Down versus the Pitch Elementals. And what I mean by Pitch Elementals is the Modern Horizon cards that evoke by exiling a card in our hand. So what we need to see here again is obviously the evoke part of the ability and how it interacts. Because if there is a Dress Down already on the board and we try to evoke the Pitch Elemental like Solitude from our hand, it obviously will not have the ability to do the enter the battlefield thing. Also, again, if it's played in response to us casting the elemental, again it will not have that ability. But here is the difference. If we already play the elemental and it resolved, the ability will go on the stack, and then if our opponent responds with Dress Down, the ability won't be removed from the stack. That's because when the ability is already placed on the stack, even if the creature loses the ability still resolves as normal. In order to stop an ability on the stack, you need something like a Stifle or a Disallow. Now, let's see what happens with the Evoke part. Well, Evoke is a little bit different than Dust. So, Evoke represents two abilities again. It's a static ability that functions in any zone from which the card with Evoke can be cast, and a triggered ability that functions on the battlefield. So, what Evoke means is Evoke, and usually has a cost, the Pitch Elementals will have exiled a card from the corresponding color from your hand, and you may cast the card by paying the Evoke cost rather than your regular mana cost. But when you do that, the creature gains the ability that when this permanent enters the battlefield, if you pay the Evoke cost, its controller sacrifices it. What that is that makes it different than Dust is because Dust is a trigger that puts a delay trigger on the stack when the Dust cost is paid. Here, when the Evoke cost is paid, the creature gets an ability that writes when this permanent enters the battlefield. If the Evoke cost was paid, its controller sacrifices. So, let's say we go ahead and pitch a card to cast Solitude, and our opponent responds with Dress Down. Dress Down comes into play, then the Solitude comes into play, and because of the effect of Dress Down that removes the abilities, it also removes the ability that would cause it to be sacrificed. So, if there is a Dress Down already on the battlefield, or is cast in response to us casting Solitude, then we get to keep the elemental, but we don't use either of the abilities. Again, if you play the Dress Down after the elemental has resolved, we actually lose the elemental also. So, to recap, Pitch Elementals and generally Evoke cards with removing ability cards work like this. If they're already on the battlefield or they are played in response, we don't get to sacrifice the card. If they are played after the abilities have been put onto the stack, the abilities will resolve as normal. The next interaction covers the Amulet Titan deck, and especially the newest condition Cultivator Colossus and Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. So, what Cultivator Colossus does, at least the part that we care about in this interaction, is the triggered ability. This triggered ability reads that you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, and if you do, you draw a card and repeat the process. That's a hold triggered ability. It's a trigger ability that needs to do it multiple times and resolves once. So, what we mean by that is that after every player has passed priority on the trigger being placed on the stack for the Cultivator Colossus, we resolve the ability all at once. So, we may put a land from our hand, we draw a card. If we do that, we put again a land, and again a land, and again until we choose to stop. And our opponents or us cannot respond at least we have chosen to stop the process. This is very important because let's say you have our amulet on the board and we put a land with our Cultivator Colossus, which is a bounce land like the Girl Turf. That means that that trigger cannot be placed on the stack until a player could get priority and state-based actions checked. And so we cannot put the Growth Turf in, then trigger our amulet, trigger the Growth Turf to return to the hand and do it that infinite times. Because the trigger happens all at once. So what will happen here is after we finish putting our lands into play, every ability that would trigger triggers. So the Growth Turf will trigger, the amulets will trigger, etc, etc. Where this is the most important is with Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, which is one of the win conditions of the deck. Because we actually need to do something and do it very carefully on this interaction. So Valakut, in order to be able to trigger, we need to at least control 5 other mountains. So what will happen here, let's make it a little bit simpler. Let's say you have 3 lands and the Dryad of Elysian Grove. And we play the Cultivator Colossus. Let's say we drop 5 more lands and the third of those lands is a Valakut. So let's say we go Semi-Growth Chamber, Glue Turf, Valakut and Forest, for example. How many times would Valakut trigger here? Note here that Dryad of the Elysian Grove makes every land into every tile, which means every land we play will also be a mountain. So we have 3 lands, we put Groltarf into play, then we put Semi-Growth Chamber to play, then we put Valakut into play. That's our 6th land. And also, because it's now a mountain, that means that Valakut would trigger even for itself, because we control at least 5 other mountains. Valakut plus 5 lands, which are all also mountains. And then we put a forest, which is also a mountain. That means that Valakut would trigger twice. Now, how would these triggers happen? These triggers will wait because the condition for the trigger has been met, which is the land to enter the battlefield, but the triggers cannot be placed on the stack until state-based actions checked, which wait until an ability or spell has already resolved. So in this case we get only 2 Valakut triggers and after Cultivator Colossus are resolved. This is very important because we cannot go play like 8 lands and then play Valakut and have it trigger for other lands. So if you're on this deck, the best thing you could do is wait and play your Valakut first. So to recap here, Cultivator Colossus triggered ability resolves as a whole trigger. That means that we must play the lands one by one, and every trigger that would happen happens after the ability has already resolved, so we cannot go infinite with a bounce land, and the triggers still look for the conditions to happen. So if we want to trigger our Valakut on time, we should play it before and wait for the 6th land and beyond to trigger. And lastly, I want to cover some basic Blood Moon interaction, because Blood Moon is a card that is pretty much tied to the modern format. It will be used probably forever, and it's a card that has caused a lot of rules to change and comes up very often to exactly how cards work, because there was a change in the rules after Alpine Moon. But let's take a look at some interactions. So first things first, the most common interaction, Blood Moon plus Urza Saga. I have made a whole video on Urza Saga which you can check here. But pretty much Blood Moon kills Urza Saga all the time, meaning that if either player has an Urza Saga on the side of the field and the player plays a Blood Moon, the Saga will go to the graveyard because it loses all abilities, and the Saga with maximum chapter reached and no abilities makes the maximum chapter to be 0, so the Saga will go to the graveyard as a state-based action. Next up is Blood Moon and any replacement effects on lands. That means stuff like your Shock lands. So Shock lands always come into play untapped, and you don't have the option to pay the life or play them tapped when Blood Moon is on the board. Because Blood Moon is a continuous effect, the effect of coming along to play, either tap or pay the life, which is a Shock lands, is a replacement effect. And when we go to the interaction between continuous and replacement effects, we always see the card and imagine it as it would be on the battlefield. So if we try to play the Shock land, how that will look on the battlefield, it will look like a mountain because it's a non-basic land. Also, for Cavern of Souls, it's really interesting. There are two things here. So if we have already played the Cavern and chosen a type, then if the opponent plays Blood Moon, it's obviously a mountain, but if the Blood Moon is removed, the type is remembered, it's stored on the land, so we'll be able to use the ability to add the mana for a certain creature type. But if there's already a Blood Moon and we try to play Cavern of Souls, then the land has no ability, so we don't get to actually make a choice for Cavern of Souls. Also, Blood Moon completely nullifies the effects of Urbuk, Tome of Yawgmoth, and Yamimaya, Cradle of Growth, because of the dependency effect we mentioned later. Essentially, Blood Moon will always make them lose their ability to become basic mountains, so you never have swamps or forests, depending on which one you control. Essentially, again, they are on the same layer that try to add a type, but Blood Moon's existence makes so that they wouldn't have an effect, so Blood Moon is applied first. An interesting thing to note here is for Dryad of the Elysian Grove and Prismatic Omen on the same vein, because they essentially have the same effect. Here there is actually a timestamp importance because they are independent from each other. So if we have already played the Dryad and our opponent plays Blood Moon, then the non-basic lands which become just mountains, but the basic lands will still have all of the land types. If there is a Blood Moon and we play the Dryad, our lands will have all of the land types, and then if another Blood Moon is played, they will lose them again. The only card that kind of gets around that is Chromatic Lantern, which used to be an old deck in Amulet decks, because it gives the land the ability to tap for any color of mana. It doesn't give them types, and that's in layer 6, which is later than the layer that causes Blood Moon to make them basic mountains. And the thing to understand here is that essentially Blood Moon doesn't actually remove the abilities, it's that this makes them, the lands, into mountains, for the non-basic lands at least, and that means that by game mechanics a mountain is a land that has the ability to just tap to add for red mana, so it's pretty much a game lock, let's say. So that's why it does not stop Chromatic Lantern. It doesn't matter if we had already Chromatic Lantern or we played it later. So these were some common modern format interactions that you can see if you play either on Magic Online or in real life tournaments, if you can have them. Just a side note here that I forgot to mention on the Ragavan thing. I have heard that Magic the Gathering Online has that ruling wrong. It's apparently back. I don't know if it is fixed at the time of uploading this video, but just a heads up, you might not get the same result in Magic Online as mentioned in this video. Thank you all very much for watching. See you in the next video.